I'm Tarrant.
And I'm Stella. Welcome to Meeple University How to Play the Artemis Project.
The Artemis Project is a dice worker placement game in which players are attempting to successfully colonise the Jovian moon of Europa. At the time that we're filming this video, the Artemis Project is active on Kickstarter, so do check it out there if you're interested.
In this video, we are using the print and play version of the game, as the game is still active on Kickstarter. So the design and components may not be final, and we are also using other components from other games in this video.
And now let's learn how to play. In the Artemis Project, players are attempting to colonise Europa, taming the ocean and then taming the surface. During the game, players will send their workers, represented by these dice, out into the different action spaces on the board, where they can gain resources, energy and minerals, where they can hire colonists into their team, represented by these wooden cubes, where they can go on expeditions to gain victory points and rewards, and where they can build buildings. The game plays over 6 rounds, and while you'll gain some victory points through the game, most of your points will come at the end of the game, based on how successful you've been at building buildings, at going on expeditions, and getting the right teams of colonists together into your collection. After 6 rounds, the player with the most victory points wins. In this video, we'll be primarily teaching from a previewer's copy of the rulebook, which comes with the print and play version of the game. However, we have been talking with Mark Spector from Grand Gamers Guild, and we will include in this video some of the rules that have changed between that copy of the rulebook and the final version. However, I will point out that we still can't guarantee that these will be the final rules of the game, so do check some of the details in your rulebooks if you're playing the finished product. To set up the game, each player takes a player board and then all of the components showing a number. That is 3 energy, 3 minerals, 1 box of tools, and 1 brown colonist cube. Each player takes 5 dice in his or her colour, and 1 player is randomly assigned the first player token. To set up the main board, place each player's scoring marker at 0 on the score track, and each player's relief marker at the bottom of the relief track. And then set up the decks of cards, separately shuffling the surface buildings, the ocean buildings, and the expedition cards, putting them near their relevant areas. Take the event cards, shuffle them up and deal out 6 of them, removing the rest from the game. These 6 cards will be used once per round, and so they count as the round counter for the game. Once these are done, the game will be over. Then take 4 blue cubes, 4 purple cubes, and 4 red cubes and place them in this area of the board. Then put all of the remaining colonist cubes into a cloth bag. This completes the basic setup for the game. Next, I'll take you through the initial setup for each of the 6 rounds of the game. I've got the board looking as it might at the end of a previous round, with some pieces and cards still in place. Obviously these won't be here when you do this initial setup for round 1. The first thing you do in each round is draw a new event card. It will have a letter on it, and you place the event reminder token next to that corresponding letter on the board. This tells you what order to activate that event compared with the locations. In Area 1, the hangars, remove any cards there from previous rounds, and then deal new cards equal to the number of players minus 1, as shown here. If the new card shows a colonist as a reward, draw a random one from the bag and place it on the card, and if it shows a building icon, draw a building from the active building pile and place it beside that card. To set up Area 2, the vents, you'll first sweep away any leftover energy that was there from the previous round. Then put out new energy for the next round. In the finished version of the game, you'll refer to the expedition cards that were laid out for this round, and they will have an icon on them telling you how much energy to add to the game for that card. If you're playing with the print and play copy, roll a number of dice equal to the number of players minus 1 and place that much energy on the board, as long as there's at least 2 energy per player. You'll set up Area 3, the quarry, in exactly the same way. Sweep out any minerals that were there, and then place new minerals based on what's printed on the expedition cards, or a new roll of the dice if you're playing the print and play. In Area 4, the Gantry, you will leave in place any buildings that were there from the end of previous rounds, and then add one new building per player in the game, stopping if you get to 8 cards. In rounds 1 from 3, you'll draw from the Ocean Building pack, and in rounds 4 from 6, you'll draw from the Surface Building pack. In the first round of the game, you'll add one extra building, so you'll start the game with as many buildings as there are players plus 1. Finally, in Area 5, draw a number of random colonists from the bag equal to the number of players plus 2, and place them in this area, adding them to any that were left over from the previous round. Stop if you get to 12. There is no round set up in Areas 6 or in this area with the exclamation mark. You're now ready to play the round. After finishing the setup for each round, the round goes to the dice placement phase, followed by the resolution phase. In the dice placement phase, all players first roll their 5 dice. These are the workers that they'll have available for this round. Then, starting with the player who has the first player token and going clockwise around the board, players take it in turns to place 1 die onto one of the 7 available action locations. Players will go in sequence, placing dice on the board, respecting different rules at each of the different locations, which I'll go into shortly. Once all players have placed all 5 of their dice, play will proceed to the resolution phase, where each of these locations will be resolved in number order. At any point during the dice placement phase, a player may spend 1 or more boxes of tools to modify the number of pips on a die up or down by 1. In this case, the player could spend 2 tools to turn this 4 into a 6. Players cannot wrap around a 6 into a 1 or a 1 into a 6 in this way, and cannot increase the number of pips beyond 6. Next, I'll talk about each of the 7 locations, both how to place dice there and how to resolve dice. But remember that you won't be resolving until all dice have been placed for the round. The first location is the hangars, and this is where players attempt to complete expeditions. When placing a die in the hangars, a player may take any one of his or her dice, regardless of the number of pips on it, chooses one of the available expeditions, and then places the die next to that card at the bottom of the column. Any subsequent players who place dice on the same expedition will place it above, and this keeps track of the order of placement, which can be a tiebreaker when resolving these locations. A player can have multiple dice on the same expedition and can go out onto different expeditions in the same round. When the time comes to resolve the hangars, each of the cards is resolved separately. Add up the number of pips on dice that are next to a certain card and compare it with the number in the top right corner of that card. If the number of pips meets or exceed the number on the card, then the expedition is successful and players on that expedition will receive rewards. Check to see who has the most pips committed to that expedition. That player gets his or her choice from the 2 benefits shown at the bottom of that card, in this case 5 minerals or 3 minerals, and the player also takes 1 expedition badge. These are worth victory points at the end of the game. The player who has the second most pips then takes the remaining reward and an expedition badge. In the event of a tie, whichever player has a die lower down in the column, that is, who placed it first, breaks the tie. In the event where 3 or 4 players have dice on a single expedition, the player with the most pips takes the first reward and second most pips takes the second reward. Any other players get nothing. There are no rewards left for them at the bottom of the card, and they also do not get to take an expedition badge. So it's in players' interest to make sure that if they're going on an expedition, they are among the top 2. However, any player who misses out on rewards on a successful expedition in this manner gets to move his or her marker 1 step up the relief track for each die committed to that expedition. The relief track is a place where players will get compensation rewards for any dice that were not used for their intended purposes. And I'll talk more about how that works later in the video. When taking a colonist reward from an expedition, the rules are the same as if you'd taken that colonist at Area 5 for free. And when taking a building reward, it's the same as if you had built a building from Area 4 for free. And we'll learn about the rules for that later on in the video. When you take a victory point bonus from an expedition, simply move up the victory point track. If the total on the dice does not meet or exceed this number, the expedition is unsuccessful. The players do not get expedition badges, and they do not get any of the rewards. However, for each die that a player has on an unsuccessful expedition, the player moves his or her marker one step up the relief track. During the placement phase, players may communicate across the table in order to agree on certain expeditions that they'll go on in order to improve their chances of success. Of course, players can lie when they're having these negotiations, and players are not permitted to trade goods between each other as part of negotiations. When sending a die out to the hangars to complete an expedition, a player may also send one or more colonists from his or her shelters. Any colonists who are on buildings cannot be sent. When doing this, a player may send one colonist of red, blue or purple colour, or may send as many brown colonists as he or she wishes. If a player places a die with one or more pioneers, each pioneer adds 1 pip to that die. So this would count as a 7 green and a 1 red, and this would be a successful expedition. If a player sends a blue engineer onto an expedition, then that player, if the expedition is successful, will gain 2 resources, energy or minerals, of his or her choice as part of the reward, even if he or she doesn't qualify for one of the main 2 rewards. If the expedition is unsuccessful, the engineer does not get this benefit. If the player places a red marine cube when doing an expedition, the player may immediately reduce one other player's die on that expedition by 1 or 2 pips, down to a minimum of 1. This makes the expedition less likely to succeed, but makes that player more likely to get first pick of reward if it is successful. Finally, you can place a purple steward onto an expedition if the die you placed is the first die on that card and it is a 1 or a 2. This means the expedition starts with a relatively low chance of success. However, if it is ultimately successful and you qualify for one of the 2 main rewards on that card, then the steward will give you a bonus victory point. After you've resolved an expedition, any colonists that you sent on that expedition are returned to your shelters, not to any of your buildings. All of these specific bonuses are printed here on the player board. And remember that you can only send 1 cube from your shelters per die, unless you're sending brown pioneers, in which case you can send as many as you wish. Next, we'll talk about location 2, the vents, and location 3, the quarry. And both of these work in the same way. The vents are where players will gain energy, and the quarry is where players will gain minerals. When placing dice in these locations, players will place their dice in ascending order, regardless of the order in which they're placed. So the first 2 dice might come like this, but then if the green player came with a 1, it would go on the left-hand side of the column. In the event that a player places a matching die, it goes on the right of any existing dice in that number. There is no limit to the number of dice which can be placed in either of these locations. When the time comes to resolve each of these locations, players will take their energy or minerals based on the number of pips in their dice, resolving the dice from left to right. So in this case, the green player would take 1 energy, red would take 2, yellow would take 2, and then 3, black would take 4, and then there are only 2 left. With this die, the black player would take whatever is left, and the red player, with nothing left at all, would move 1 step up the relief track for the die not being used. minerals are resolved in the same way. The fourth location is the Gantry, and this is where players will spend minerals to build buildings. There are two types of buildings in the game. Ocean buildings, which come out in the first 3 rounds and give players additional action bonuses that they can take, and surface buildings, which come out in the last 3 rounds and give players end-of-game victory point bonuses. During the placement phase, a player may place any die onto any one of these buildings in order to bid a certain number of minerals that they intend to spend to build that building. Players can place their dice on different buildings, or at any point a player may place a higher die onto a card which already has dice in order to bid a higher number of minerals. A player who already has a die there could come back and place another die to outbid the first player. A player may even wish to outbid himself or herself under certain circumstances, and this is allowable. When the time comes to resolve the Gantry, any building that has dice on it is resolved as follows. The player who has the single highest die on that card, in this case green, pays the amount of minerals matching that number of pips. So in this case 6. Green would pay 6, not 7, because you look only at the highest die. Then the player takes that building into his or her collection, and any players who missed out move 1 step up the relief track. This includes the player who built that building, as long as that player was outbid by at least 1 other player. On this one here, red could build that building for 5 minerals, but would not get to move up the relief track because he or she only outbid himself or herself. An alternative outcome when resolving a building is that the player with the highest bid may no longer wish to build that building for that price, or due to some other plans going wrong, may not be able to afford it. If this happens, the player simply removes his or her die and does not go up the relief track, because this was the player's own error, and he or she is not rewarded for that. The player with the next highest bid can then build that building at his or her bid. When a player builds a building, he or she places it next to his or her player board, either down the bottom for an ocean card or up the top for a surface card. At that time, a player may then move any number of the correct type of colonists from his or her shelters into that building, not into other buildings and not from other buildings. So in this place, the player could put a purple there and one of these other 2 into the blank wild spot, which can take any colonist. Note that moving your colonists around between buildings and your shelters is limited in the game. This is one of the few ways that you can fill up your building, and I'll go through those rules later in the video as a summary at the end. Once a building has been fully staffed, that is, all of its squares are full, you will be able to activate the bonus effect shown at the top of the card, but this does not occur until the upkeep phase, which occurs at the end of each round. The 5th location is the doorstep, and this is where you hire new colonists. Placement of dice in the doorstep works the same way as the quarry and the vents. You will place your dice in ascending order, and in the case of any ties, you will go in front of dice of the same colour that has preceded it. Once the time comes to resolve this location, you will resolve from left to right. A player who places a 1 or a 2 can hire one of the available colonists from this supply, paying 2 energy for that colonist. Anyone who places a 3 or a 4 may hire 1 or 2 colonists from the supply. Again, paying 2 energy for each colonist hired. This process continues until all players have hired colonists, or there are no dice left. And once again, if any player has dice left when there are no colonists remaining, he or she may move 1 step up the relief track. When a player hires colonists at the doorstep, he or she may then immediately put any of the hired colonists into buildings with open spaces or into the shelters. The 6th location is the Academy, which has 2 dice placement spaces in a 3 or 4 player game, or only 1 in a 2 player game. When you place a die in this location during the placement phase, you must also place one of your colonists of any colour into the space above. And this can come from your shelters, or it can come from one of your buildings. When the time comes to the resolution phase, resolving from left to right, you will discard that colonist and replace it from this area with the matching type. So for a 1 or a 2, that colonist will turn into an engineer. For a 3 or a 4, it will turn into a marine. And a 5 or a 6, it will turn into a steward. This supply is limited, so if all of these are removed during previous rounds, that specific type of colonist will no longer be available. The player then takes that new colonist and can immediately put it into a building, the same one or a different one, or into the shelters. Colonists that are discarded in this location go into a discard pile, not back into the bag. They only go back into the bag if the bag runs empty. And these colonists that were placed here at the start of the game are not refilled at any point during the game. The final location on the board is the outfitter, indicated by this exclamation mark. And unlike all of the other spaces, you resolve this immediately. This is a place to get tools. If you place a 1, 2, 3 or 4 in this location, you'll get 1 box of tools. And if you place a 5 or a 6, you will take 2 boxes of tools, which you will be able to use on subsequent placements during the same round. While you're resolving all of the actions in location number order, at some point you will cross over the event marker that you placed at the start of the round, and this is the moment at which you resolve that round's event. Some of the events will penalise players for doing certain actions, others will reward players for doing certain actions. There are also events marked with an A, which will affect that round's setup. Either way, resolve that event when you get to that stage of the resolution. Through the game, any time a player is unable to utilise his or her die, he or she will move 1 step up the relief track and immediately claim a compensation benefit from that track. The player can take the benefit from the position on which his or her marker sits, or from any position below it. So the first time a player takes relief, he or she will take 2 tools. The second time a player takes relief, he or she may take 2 energy or 2 tools, and so on as the markers move up the track. The markers never move down the track, they will only continue moving up during the game as the player takes more and more relief. After all of these steps, you proceed to the upkeep phase, which is detailed down here on this portion of your player board. The first step of upkeep is that each player may move 1 colonist or swap 1 pair of colonists. This means you can take a colonist from your shelters and put it into a building, move a colonist from one building to another building or to the shelters, or you can swap 2 colonists' positions. You can only make one of these moves at this time. Next, all players may activate all of their ocean buildings that are fully staffed. So in this case, the player could take this action, spending 2 energy for 1 victory point, which is marked on the main board, but would not be able to take this action here. Players may activate their ocean buildings in any order they choose. Next, all players must pay energy for any colonists in their shelters. Any leftover colonists require 1 energy to keep warm. So in this case, the player would need to spend 3 energy. If the player does not have enough energy, he or she must discard any colonists who were not kept warm. They're angry and they left the colony. That's what happened. Players who do have enough energy to heat all of their colonists cannot spend less than the full amount. They must keep them warm if capable. Then set up the game board as described at the start of this video for the next round. And finally, the player who has the fewest total resources gets to choose who gets the first player marker for the next round. A player may wish to go first in order to lock down the best position in a certain location, or may wish to go last in order to respond to what other people have done, maybe swooping in to get some cheap benefits on an expedition, or getting the final bid on a building. One of the things to keep in mind when playing this game is the restrictions on how you can move your colonists around. So I'll just summarise all of those now. When you are sending colonists out onto expeditions, they must come from your shelters, not from buildings. When they come back from those expeditions, they'll go back into your shelters. Therefore, you will need to have these during the placement phase, and so any colonists that you hold back for expeditions will have to be heated at the end of the round. Then, anytime you build a building, at that moment you may immediately put as many colonists as you can into that building. Anytime you hire new colonists, either from the academy or from the doorstep, you can immediately place those colonists into any buildings where they'll fit, or into the shelters if you wish. Other than that, you're only able to make one move or one swap per round during the upkeep phase. One movement, or one swap, moving a couple of colonists around, however you wish. There are also 2 ocean buildings which improve your flexibility on moving colonists around. Expedition Control gives you 3 slots from which you can send colonists out on expeditions without having to leave them in the shelters, and this one does not have to be fully staffed in order to use it. The Shuttle Bay, if it's fully staffed, gives you 2 extra moves or swaps during upkeep, so you'll be able to move 3 colonists around in each round. After the 6th round is complete, proceed to endgame scoring, which is demonstrated by all of these icons at the bottom of your card. Go through each of them in sequence. Firstly, you will score for stored energy and stored minerals. To calculate this, convert any sets of 5 into 1 in your stored column, and then score 1 point for each stored energy and each stored mineral. This is limited to a maximum of 3 per resource type. Then score all of your fully staffed ocean buildings. Each ocean building has an end of game scoring formula on it, and as long as you have fully staffed it, you will score the points for that building. So here, the player would score 2 points for this one, 2 points for this one, but would not score this one at all because it's not fully staffed. Then count up the total number of buildings in your colony. In this case, it's 5. And in this case, it doesn't matter whether they're fully staffed or not. Score the number of victory points on the bottom row corresponding to that. So in this case, 3 points. Next, you can gather up all of your colonists from all of your buildings and your shelters. Sort them out and find out how many complete sets of 1 of each colonist type you have in your colony. You will score 3 points for each such set. Then, for any unmatched colonists, gain 1 point for every 3 left over, rounded down. So the colonist score for this player is 3 plus 3 plus 1 is 7. There are pretty good points in making these sets, so don't ignore this as you go through the game. Count up all of your expedition badges and score the number of points printed on the bottom row here. So 5 expedition badges is worth 3 points. Finally, each player adds up the total number of toolboxes remaining, and the player or players with the most gains 2 points. The player with the highest score wins, and in the event of a tie, the player who went earlier in turn order in the final round wins the game.
And that's how to play the Artemis Project. We hope that you enjoyed the video, and we hope that you enjoyed the game.
Please click on the Meeple to subscribe to our channel if you'd like to hear more from Meeple University.